The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under the magnificent crystal chandeliers that had witnessed countless royal gatherings over the centuries. Tonight was different, though. The air carried an electric tension that seemed to dance between the golden walls adorned with priceless paintings and tapestries. King Charles III stood at the center of it all, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the sea of faces before him. Dignitaries, nobles, and members of the extended royal family filled every corner of the opulent space, their conversations creating a gentle hum that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Catherine, Princess of Wales, moved gracefully through the crowd, her emerald green gown flowing like liquid silk with each step. The dress had been specially chosen for this evening, its deep color complementing the emerald tiara that once belonged to Queen Mary. Her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the diamond earrings that caught the light with every turn of her head. She smiled warmly at each guest she encountered, her natural charm evident in the way people seemed to gravitate toward her presence. Across the room, Queen Camilla held court with a group of ambassadors' wives, discussing the upcoming charity initiatives that had become her passion since ascending to the throne. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and she wore a stunning sapphire necklace that had been a wedding gift from Charles years ago. Despite her regal bearing, there was a subtle tension in her shoulders that only those who knew her well might notice. She occasionally glanced toward her husband, watching as he moved through his duties with the practiced ease of someone born to rule. The evening had begun like any other state function. Guests arrived in their finest attire, photographers captured moments for posterity, and the royal protocol unfolded with clockwork precision. Charles had delivered his opening remarks with the eloquence expected of a monarch, speaking about unity, tradition, and the importance of the Commonwealth ties that bound their nations together. The applause that followed was warm and respectful, echoing through the palatial halls that had heard similar speeches for generations. As the formal portion of the evening concluded and guests began to mingle more freely, Charles found himself drawn into conversations about trade agreements and diplomatic relations. His years as Prince of Wales had prepared him well for these discussions, and he navigated the complex web of international politics with the skill of a seasoned statesman. Yet something seemed to weigh on his mind tonight, a distant look in his eyes that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere even as he engaged in the necessary pleasantries of royal duty. William, Prince of Wales, stood near the grand piano where a classical quartet played softly in the background. His tall frame was impeccably dressed in his evening wear, and he watched the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who would one day inherit all of this responsibility. His relationship with his father had evolved significantly over the years, from the rebellious teenager who had struggled with the constraints of royal life to the dutiful son who now understood the weight of the crown that would eventually rest upon his head. The guest list for this particular evening read like a who's who of international society. Prime ministers, presidents, and royalty from across Europe and the Commonwealth had gathered to celebrate the renewal of several important treaties. The Danish queen, resplendent in midnight blue, chatted animatedly with the Swedish crown princess about environmental initiatives. The Canadian prime minister discussed trade relations with his Australian counterpart, while their wives admired the palace's impressive art collection. Catherine found herself in conversation with the Archbishop of Canterbury, discussing the upcoming youth programs that the Church and the Royal Foundation were developing together. Her genuine interest in social causes had always been one of her most admired qualities, and tonight was no exception. She listened intently as he described the challenges facing young people in modern Britain, her eyes bright with the kind of engagement that had made her such a beloved figure among the British people. The palace staff moved like silent ghosts through the crowd, ensuring that champagne glasses remained filled and that every guest's needs were attended to with the discreet efficiency that had made royal entertaining legendary. Footmen in their distinctive red livery navigated the crowd with silver trays, while the master of the household coordinated the evening's events from his strategic position near the main entrance. As the evening progressed, Charles found himself increasingly drawn to observe Catherine from across the room. There was something about her presence tonight that seemed to illuminate everything around her. Perhaps it was the way she genuinely listened when people spoke to her, or how her laughter seemed to lift the spirits of everyone within earshot. She had grown into her role as Princess of Wales with a grace that reminded him of his beloved mother, Queen Elizabeth II, yet with a modern sensibility that connected with people in ways the monarchy had never achieved before. Camilla, ever perceptive, noticed her husband's distraction. She had learned to read his moods over their many years together, understanding the subtle signs that indicated when something was troubling him or when his mind was elsewhere. Tonight, she sensed both. There was an undercurrent of emotion in Charles that she couldn't quite identify, something that seemed to go deeper than the usual pressures of royal duty. The conversation between father and daughter-in-law had become something special over the years. What had begun as a relationship born of necessity and protocol had evolved into something much more meaningful. Catherine's respect for tradition combined with her fresh perspectives on modern challenges had created a unique dynamic with Charles. He often sought her input on matters relating to the younger generation, valuing her insights into how the monarchy could remain relevant in an ever-changing world. When Catherine had first married into the family, there had been the inevitable comparisons to Diana, Princess of Wales. The media had been relentless in their analysis of every gesture, every choice of clothing, every public appearance. But Catherine had navigated these challenges with remarkable poise, creating her own identity within the royal framework while honoring the memory of William's mother. Charles had watched this transformation with growing admiration and respect. The string quartet transitioned into a piece by Vivaldi, the familiar strains of the Four Seasons providing an elegant backdrop to the evening's conversations. Several guests paused in their discussions to appreciate the music, and Catherine found herself momentarily alone as her conversation partners moved to refresh their drinks. She stood near one of the tall windows that looked out over the palace gardens, the moonlight casting silver shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. It was in this moment that Charles felt an overwhelming urge to speak with her. Not about official business or royal duties, but something deeper. The weight of the crown, the responsibilities that seemed to multiply with each passing day, and the constant awareness that every decision he made would be scrutinized by history had been pressing down on him lately. Catherine, with her natural warmth and understanding, had become someone he could confide in without fear of judgment. He excused himself from his conversation with the German chancellor and began to make his way across the room toward where Catherine stood. The crowd seemed to part naturally before him, as crowds always did for royalty, but tonight he barely noticed the bows and curtsies that followed in his wake. His focus was entirely on reaching Catherine, on having the conversation that had been building in his mind throughout the evening. Camilla watched this movement with growing concern. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was acting on impulse rather than protocol. There was something in his bearing, in the determination of his stride, that suggested this was more than a casual royal chat. She began to move in the same direction, though the crowd made her progress slower than his. The assembled dignitaries began to take notice of the king's purposeful movement across the ballroom. Conversations quieted as people turned to observe where their monarch was heading. In the complex world of royal watching, every gesture had meaning, every interaction was analyzed for its deeper significance. The fact that Charles was walking directly toward the Princess of Wales, with such obvious intent, was not lost on the experienced diplomatic community. William, from his position near the piano, also noticed his father's approach toward Catherine. There was something in Charles's expression that he couldn't quite read, something that seemed more personal than the usual royal interactions that characterized these formal events. He began to move closer, his protective instincts as both a husband and a future king beginning to stir. The moment stretched with anticipation as Charles drew nearer to Catherine, who remained unaware of the attention now focused on her corner of the room. She was studying a portrait of Queen Victoria, lost in thought about the weight of history that surrounded them all. The irony was not lost on those watching that she stood beneath the image of another woman who had shaped the monarchy during a time of great change. As Charles reached the halfway point of his journey across the ballroom, the conversations around him had quieted to whispers. The diplomatic corps, trained to notice every nuance of royal behavior, sensed that something significant was about to unfold. The evening, which had begun as a routine state function, was transforming into something none of them had expected. The anticipation in the room was palpable now, though Catherine remained blissfully unaware of the drama building around her. She turned from the portrait just as Charles drew near, her face lighting up with the warm smile that had charmed the world. But there was something different in Charles's expression tonight, something that went beyond the usual familial affection they shared. What happened next would be discussed in royal circles for years to come, analyzed by historians and biographers, and remembered as one of those pivotal moments when the private emotions of the royal family briefly intersected with their public roles. The King of England was about to reach out to his daughter-in-law in a way that would surprise everyone present, including himself. Charles stood before Catherine now, close enough that she could see the emotion flickering in his eyes. The noise of the grand ballroom seemed to fade into the background as he searched for words that had been forming in his heart throughout the evening. She looked up at him with genuine warmth, her head tilted slightly in the way that indicated she was giving him her complete attention. This was one of her most endearing qualities, the ability to make whoever she was speaking with feel as though they were the only person in the room. The weight of kingship had been pressing heavily on Charles's shoulders lately. The constant stream of state papers requiring his signature, the endless parade of diplomatic meetings, and the crushing responsibility of leading a nation through increasingly complex global challenges had left him feeling isolated. Even surrounded by advisors and family members, he often felt profoundly alone in his role as monarch. Tonight, looking at Catherine's understanding face, he felt compelled to share something of that burden. Catherine noticed immediately that something was different about her father-in-law tonight. In the years since she had married William, she had become adept at reading the subtle moods of the royal family. Charles had always been kind to her, welcoming her into the family with a warmth that had surprised many royal watchers who remembered the tensions surrounding his first marriage. But tonight there was a vulnerability in his expression that she had rarely seen before. The other guests in the ballroom had begun to notice the intensity of the conversation developing between the king and the Princess of Wales. Diplomatic conversations gradually quieted as attention shifted toward the pair standing beneath Queen Victoria's portrait. The Spanish ambassador paused mid-sentence in his discussion with the French foreign minister, both men trained to recognize when a significant moment was unfolding before them. Charles began to speak, his voice low enough that only Catherine could hear his words over the gentle strains of the string quartet. He told her about the loneliness of leadership, about making decisions that affected millions of people while having no one who truly understood the weight of that responsibility. He spoke about his mother's death, how even now, years later, he sometimes reached for the phone to call her for advice before remembering that those conversations were no longer possible. Catherine listened with the kind of focused attention that had made her such an effective royal representative. She had learned over the years that sometimes the most important thing she could offer was simply her presence and her willingness to truly hear what someone was saying. As Charles continued speaking, she began to understand that this was more than just royal small talk or family conversation. This was a man sharing his deepest concerns with someone he trusted. The conversation between them deepened as Charles found himself opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone since his mother's passing. Catherine's responses were thoughtful and empathetic, drawing on her own experiences of adjusting to royal life and the unique challenges it presented. She spoke about the isolation she had felt in her early years as William's girlfriend, when every public appearance was scrutinized and every fashion choice analyzed for hidden meanings. Meanwhile, Camilla had been making her way across the room, excusing herself politely from conversations as she moved toward her husband and daughter-in-law. She could see from Charles's body language that this was more than a casual chat, and her protective instincts were beginning to stir. After decades of marriage and partnership, she had developed a finely tuned sense of when Charles was struggling emotionally, and tonight all her internal alarms were sounding. William, too, had begun moving closer to his wife and father, though his progress was slower due to his position near the piano and the number of guests who felt compelled to engage the heir to the throne in conversation. He watched the interaction between Charles and Catherine with growing curiosity, noting the unusual intensity of their exchange. His protective instincts regarding Catherine had never fully relaxed, even after all their years of marriage. The diplomatic community present at the function had decades of experience reading the subtle dynamics of royal interactions. They understood that in the carefully choreographed world of monarchy, spontaneous emotional conversations were rare and potentially significant. The Canadian High Commissioner found herself unconsciously leaning forward, trying to read the body language of the conversation unfolding across the room. As Charles continued speaking, Catherine found herself moved by his vulnerability and honesty. This was a side of the king that the public never saw, the private man who struggled with doubts and loneliness despite being surrounded by people at all times. She began to share her own observations about royal life, about how she had learned to find strength in the knowledge that their public roles, while demanding, also provided opportunities to make meaningful differences in people's lives. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Charles began speaking about his relationships with his family members. He expressed deep pride in William's development as a future king, but also shared his regret about some of the difficulties their relationship had endured over the years. The pressure of royal duty had sometimes created distance between them that Charles wished he could bridge more effectively. Catherine found herself in the unique position of being both William's wife and Charles's daughter-in-law, giving her insights into both men's perspectives. She spoke gently about William's deep respect for his father, despite their occasional disagreements about royal protocol or approach to modern challenges. Her words seemed to provide Charles with comfort he hadn't expected to find in the middle of a formal state function. The string quartet had moved on to a piece by Bach, the complex harmonies providing an oddly appropriate soundtrack to the emotional complexity of the conversation unfolding beneath Queen Victoria's watchful painted gaze. Several guests had begun to notice the length and apparent intensity of the exchange between the King and Princess of Wales, though none could hear the actual words being spoken. As the conversation continued, Charles found himself sharing memories of his mother's guidance and wisdom, stories that he rarely told anyone. Catherine listened with the kind of respectful attention that encouraged him to continue, her occasional questions drawing out details and emotions that he had kept locked away since Queen Elizabeth's passing. There was something healing about being able to share these memories with someone who understood the unique context of royal loss. The emotional weight of the conversation was beginning to show on both their faces. Charles's usual composed royal demeanor had softened into something more human and vulnerable, while Catherine's expression reflected the empathy and understanding that had made her beloved by the British public. Their body language spoke of trust and mutual respect that had developed over years of shared royal duties and family gatherings. Camilla had finally reached a position where she could see her husband and Catherine more clearly, though she was still too far away to hear their conversation. What she could observe was the obvious emotional intensity of their exchange, something that sparked both concern and curiosity in her mind. She had learned to trust Catherine over the years, knowing that the younger woman's intentions toward the family were always honorable, but the unusual nature of this conversation was unsettling. The German chancellor, experienced in reading international political dynamics, found himself wondering if this intense conversation between the British king and his daughter-in-law had implications beyond family matters. In the complex world of modern monarchy, personal relationships often intersected with matters of state in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. As Charles continued sharing his thoughts and concerns, Catherine began to recognize the depth of trust he was placing in her. This was more than a casual family conversation. This was the King of England sharing his most private doubts and fears with someone he clearly valued as both family and confidant. The responsibility of that trust weighed on her, but also strengthened her resolve to offer whatever support and understanding she could provide. The evening's formal schedule had called for dancing to begin around this time, but the orchestra seemed reluctant to interrupt what was clearly an important conversation. The master of the household found himself in the unusual position of having to adjust the evening's timeline to accommodate the king's unexpected deep conversation with the Princess of Wales. Other royal family members present had begun to take notice of the extended conversation between Charles and Catherine. Princess, and known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, watched the interaction with the calculating eye of someone who understood that in royal circles, every conversation had the potential to become significant. The conversation between Charles and Catherine had now stretched well beyond the polite exchange that guests had initially assumed they were witnessing. The intensity of their interaction was becoming impossible to ignore, and the diplomatic community present began to speculate about what could be prompting such an obviously emotional exchange between the monarch and his daughter-in-law. As Charles continued speaking, pouring out concerns and emotions he had been carrying alone, Catherine found herself playing a role she hadn't expected when she arrived at the palace that evening. She was becoming a confidant to the King of England, a repository for fears and hopes that he felt unable to share with others. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and slightly overwhelming. The moment was building towards something that none of the guests could have anticipated when they arrived for what they assumed would be a routine state function. The emotional conversation between Charles and Catherine had reached a crescendo of intimacy that neither of them had anticipated when the evening began. Charles found himself speaking about his deepest fears regarding the future of the monarchy, his concerns about whether he could live up to the example set by his mother, and the profound loneliness that came with wearing the crown. Catherine listened with an understanding that seemed to reach into his soul, her responses demonstrating a wisdom and empathy that had grown from her own journey through the complexities of royal life. As Charles spoke about the weight of his responsibilities, something shifted in the atmosphere around them. The formal constraints that usually governed royal interactions seemed to dissolve, replaced by a genuine human connection that transcended protocol and position. Catherine's natural warmth and understanding created a safe space for Charles to express vulnerabilities he had shared with no one else since his mother's death. The guests throughout the ballroom had become increasingly aware that something extraordinary was happening. The usual background conversations had quieted to whispers, and many faces had turned toward the King and Princess of Wales. The Italian Prime Minister found himself unable to concentrate on his discussion about trade agreements, his attention drawn repeatedly to the intense exchange taking place beneath Queen Victoria's portrait. Camilla had finally positioned herself close enough to observe her husband and daughter-in-law more clearly, though she still couldn't hear their actual words. What she could see was Charles's face, more open and vulnerable than she had witnessed in months. There was something both beautiful and concerning about watching him share such obvious emotional intimacy with Catherine, even though she trusted both of them implicitly. William had also drawn nearer, his protective instincts as both a husband and a son now fully engaged. He could see that his wife was providing emotional support to his father in a way that went far beyond the usual family dynamics. While he appreciated Catherine's kindness and understanding, he was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the intensity and duration of their exchange. The conversation had evolved into something that felt almost therapeutic for Charles. Catherine's gentle questions and thoughtful responses were helping him process emotions and concerns he had been carrying in isolation. She spoke about her own experiences with public scrutiny, with the pressure of representing an ancient institution in a modern world, and with finding personal strength in the face of overwhelming responsibility. As Charles continued to open up, he began speaking about his relationship with Diana and the profound regret he carried about how that marriage had ended. This was territory he rarely discussed with anyone, but something about Catherine's presence tonight made it feel safe to explore these painful memories. Catherine listened without judgment, offering perspectives that helped him see his past in a more compassionate light. The diplomatic observers in the room were beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something historically significant. Royal emotional displays were rare enough in public settings, but this level of intimate conversation between a monarch and his daughter-in-law was unprecedented in their collective experience. As Charles spoke about his vision for the future of the monarchy, Catherine began to understand why he had sought her out tonight. She represented everything he hoped the royal family could become: modern, relatable, and genuinely committed to service. Her success in connecting with the British people while maintaining the dignity and traditions of the crown had impressed him more than she realized. The conversation took another emotional turn when Charles began speaking about his grandchildren and his hopes for their futures. His voice softened as he talked about Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, expressing both joy in their presence in his life and concern about the world they would inherit. Catherine's face lit up as she shared stories about the children and their growing awareness of their unique positions. Camilla had been joined by Princess and both women watching the extended conversation with growing fascination and slight concern. And, with her practical approach to royal duties, was beginning to wonder if the evening's protocol might need to be adjusted to accommodate whatever was unfolding between Charles and Catherine. The dancing that should have begun by now remained postponed, and guests were beginning to notice. The emotional intensity of the conversation was taking its toll on both Charles and Catherine. The king's usual composed demeanor had given way to something much more human and accessible, while Catherine's empathetic nature was fully engaged in providing support and understanding. Their body language spoke of a connection that went beyond the formal relationships typical of royal family interactions. William had finally reached a position where he could observe his wife and father more closely, though he remained respectfully distant. What he saw both moved and concerned him: the obvious trust and emotional intimacy between Charles and Catherine was touching to witness, but, as a protective husband, he was beginning to feel that the conversation had crossed into territory that made him uncomfortable. The other royal family members present had all become aware of the unusual situation developing in their midst. The Duke of Gloucester found himself in conversation with foreign dignitaries who were asking pointed questions about the significance of what they were witnessing. How should he explain that the King of England was having what appeared to be a deeply personal conversation with his daughter-in-law at a state function? As Charles continued sharing his thoughts and fears, Catherine began to recognize that she was being entrusted with information and emotions that he had shared with very few people. The weight of that trust was both humbling and slightly overwhelming. She found herself offering advice and perspective drawn from her own experiences with royal life, speaking with a wisdom that surprised even herself. The conversation had now been going on for nearly 30 minutes, an eternity in the carefully timed world of royal functions. The master of the household was beginning to show signs of stress as he tried to manage the evening's schedule around this unexpected development. Several important ceremonial moments were being delayed, but interrupting the king seemed unthinkable. Charles began speaking about his late mother's advice regarding leadership and service, sharing memories that brought tears to his eyes. Catherine listened with the reverent attention these stories deserved, occasionally offering her own reflections on Queen Elizabeth's impact and legacy. These shared memories created another layer of connection between them, bonding them in their mutual grief and admiration for the remarkable woman who had shaped both their lives. The diplomatic community was beginning to develop theories about what they were witnessing. Some speculated about possible constitutional implications, while others wondered if this might signal changes in the internal dynamics of the royal family. The French ambassador found himself mentally composing the report he would send to Paris about this unprecedented display of royal emotion. As the conversation continued, Catherine found herself sharing her own struggles with royal life more openly than she had with anyone except William. She spoke about the challenges of raising royal children in a media-saturated world, about balancing public duty with personal authenticity, and about the loneliness that sometimes came with public scrutiny. Charles listened with the same focused attention she had given him, creating a reciprocal exchange of trust and understanding. The moment was building towards something that would shock everyone in the room, including Charles and Catherine themselves. The emotional intensity of their conversation had created a bubble of intimacy that seemed to exist outside the formal constraints of royal protocol. As Charles prepared to express the depth of his gratitude for Catherine's understanding and support, something was about to happen that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The King of England, moved by the compassion and wisdom of his daughter-in-law, was about to make a gesture that would surprise everyone present, including himself. The careful boundaries that governed royal interactions were about to be crossed in a way that would leave the entire ballroom in stunned silence. The moment had arrived with an inevitability that seemed to surprise even Charles himself. As Catherine finished sharing her thoughts about the importance of authentic connection in royal service, something in her words struck him with profound emotional force. The understanding and wisdom she had shown throughout their conversation, the way she had listened without judgment to his deepest fears and concerns, and the genuine care she had demonstrated for both his well-being and the future of the monarchy had moved him beyond what protocol would normally allow. Without conscious thought, Charles reached out toward Catherine. It was not the calculated gesture of a monarch performing his duties, nor the polite interaction typical of royal family gatherings. This was the spontaneous action of a man deeply grateful for the unexpected gift of understanding he had received tonight. His hand moved toward her with the natural instinct of someone seeking to express profound appreciation and connection. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Those closest to the pair noticed the gesture immediately, and a wave of stunned silence began to ripple outward through the crowd. The string quartet, sensitive to the changing atmosphere, allowed their current piece to fade into silence. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as hundreds of eyes focused on the King and Princess of Wales. Catherine, caught completely off guard by the unexpected physical gesture, felt her heart skip a beat. In all her years as a member of the royal family, she had never experienced anything quite like this moment. The emotional intensity of their conversation had created an intimacy that transcended normal royal boundaries, but this gesture crossed into uncharted territory. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening and how she should respond. Camilla, watching from her position across the room, felt her breath catch in her throat. The sight of her husband reaching toward Catherine with such obvious emotion and spontaneity was unlike anything she had witnessed in their decades together. A complex mixture of emotions washed over her: surprise, concern, and perhaps a touch of something she couldn't quite identify. Her husband's actions seemed to exist outside the careful parameters of their marriage and royal partnership. William, observing the scene from his position near the piano, felt his protective instincts surge to full alertness. Watching his father reach toward his wife with such unexpected intimacy crossed every boundary of appropriate royal interaction. His jaw tightened as he began moving more purposefully toward the pair, though the crowd and his own uncertainty about how to respond slowed his progress. The diplomatic observers throughout the room found themselves witnessing something they had never been trained to handle. The German chancellor felt her diplomatic composure waver as she tried to process what appeared to be a deeply personal moment unfolding between the British monarch and his daughter-in-law. The carefully maintained facade of royal protocol was cracking before their eyes. Charles himself seemed almost surprised by his own action. The emotional weight of the conversation, combined with Catherine's extraordinary empathy and understanding, had overwhelmed his usual careful self-control. For a moment, the King of England had become simply a man deeply grateful for unexpected compassion and wisdom. His hand continued its movement toward Catherine, driven by an impulse that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The Princess of Wales found herself frozen in a moment that would define her relationship with the royal family for years to come. Every instinct told her that this situation required careful navigation, yet the genuine emotion behind Charles's gesture made any calculated response feel inappropriate. The man before her was not just the king, but a father figure who had been sharing his deepest vulnerabilities with her. Princess, and, observing from across the room with her characteristic directness, immediately understood that the evening had veered into territory that could have significant consequences. Her practical mind began calculating the potential ramifications while her eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene. This was not the kind of moment that could be easily explained or forgotten. The silence in the ballroom had become so complete that the soft rustle of evening gowns and the distant sound of traffic outside the palace windows seemed unnaturally loud. Hundreds of guests stood transfixed, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the modern history of the British monarchy. The Italian Prime Minister found his diplomatic training completely inadequate for processing what he was observing. Catherine's mind raced through the possible responses to Charles's gesture. She understood the emotional context that had led to this moment, but she also recognized the potential for misinterpretation by the assembled dignitaries and, eventually, by the media and public. The warmth and understanding she felt for Charles as a family member had to be balanced against the complex dynamics of royal protocol and public perception. The master of the household, watching from his strategic position near the main entrance, felt his carefully orchestrated evening spiraling beyond his control. No amount of protocol training had prepared him for managing a situation where the monarch was engaging in such an obviously personal and emotionally charged interaction at a state function. His usual confidence in handling royal events evaporated as he watched the scene unfold. Camilla began moving more purposefully toward her husband and Catherine, though the crowd of guests between them made rapid movement impossible. Her expression remained composed, but those who knew her well might have detected the subtle signs of stress and concern that she was working to conceal. This was her husband and her family, but it was also a potential crisis that could have far-reaching implications. The emotional truth of the moment was that Charles's gesture stemmed from genuine gratitude and a deep sense of connection to Catherine as both family member and trusted confidant. The conversation they had shared had provided him with a level of understanding and support that he had desperately needed but hadn't expected to find. His reaching toward her was the natural human response to unexpected compassion. However, the political and social reality was that they were not simply two family members sharing a private moment. They were the King of England and the Princess of Wales, surrounded by international dignitaries at a formal state function. Every gesture would be analyzed, interpreted, and potentially misunderstood by observers who lacked the context of their emotional conversation. Catherine's empathetic nature made her acutely aware of Charles's emotional state and the sincerity behind his gesture, but her position as William's wife and her own role within the royal family created a complex web of loyalties and responsibilities. How could she respond in a way that honored the trust Charles had placed in her while also respecting her marriage and her position within the family hierarchy? The tension in the room was becoming palpable as guests began to understand that they were witnessing something that would likely have consequences far beyond the evening's events. The Spanish ambassador found herself mentally rehearsing how she would describe this scene in her diplomatic cables, knowing that her government would want detailed information about this unprecedented royal interaction. William's movement toward his wife and father became more urgent as he recognized that the situation was developing beyond what could be easily managed or explained. His love and respect for both Catherine and Charles were being tested by a moment that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of their family relationships. The string quartet, recognizing that their musical accompaniment was no longer appropriate for the gravity of the situation, had ceased playing entirely. The silence that followed seemed to amplify the significance of every gesture and expression visible on the faces of the King and Princess of Wales. As Charles's gesture continued its trajectory toward Catherine, the room seemed suspended in time. What happened next would depend on how Catherine chose to respond to this unprecedented moment of royal vulnerability and connection. The future dynamics of the royal family, and possibly the public perception of the monarchy itself, hung in the balance of her response. The King of England had reached out to his daughter-in-law in a moment of profound gratitude and connection, but the implications of that gesture were about to reverberate through every level of British society and international relations. The careful choreography of royal life was about to be forever altered by this spontaneous expression of human emotion. The silence that enveloped the grand ballroom was so profound it seemed to have weight and substance of its own. Charles's hand had completed its movement, coming to rest gently on Catherine's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of deep gratitude and familial affection. Yet in the context of the formal state function, surrounded by international dignitaries and members of the press, the simple human gesture had taken on monumental significance that neither of them had intended. Catherine's response in that critical moment would be remembered and analyzed for decades to come. She looked up at Charles, seeing past the crown and the ceremony to the vulnerable man who had shared his deepest fears and hopes with her. Her natural empathy and understanding of human emotion told her that his gesture came from a place of genuine appreciation and family love. Without hesitation, she placed her own hand over his, a simple acknowledgement of the trust and connection they had shared during their conversation. The combined gesture, Charles's hand on Catherine's shoulder, her hand covering his, created an image that burned itself into the memory of everyone present. It was simultaneously the most natural thing in the world and the most shocking breach of royal protocol that any of them had ever witnessed. The King and the Princess of Wales stood connected in a moment of authentic human emotion that transcended the artificial boundaries of court etiquette. Camilla reached the edge of the crowd surrounding her husband and daughter-in-law just as Catherine responded to Charles's gesture. The Queen's expression remained carefully composed, but those who knew her well could see the complex emotions playing across her features. There was concern, certainly, but also a recognition that what she was witnessing came from love and family bonds rather than anything inappropriate or threatening. William arrived at almost the same moment, his protective instincts fully engaged, but his understanding of both his father and his wife allowing him to read the true nature of the moment. He could see that this was not a romantic gesture or an inappropriate advance, but rather the culmination of an emotionally intense conversation between two people who had developed a deep mutual respect and familial love over the years. The assembled dignitaries struggled to process what they were witnessing. The diplomatic training that had prepared them for reading international political situations had not equipped them to interpret this deeply personal moment between members of the British royal family. The Canadian Prime Minister found herself wondering whether this represented some shift in the power dynamics within the monarchy that her government should be monitoring. Charles himself seemed to emerge from the emotional intensity of the moment, suddenly, becoming aware of the profound silence surrounding them and the hundreds of eyes focused on their interaction. The weight of his position and the potential implications of his spontaneous gesture crashed over him like a wave. Yet as he looked at Catherine's understanding face, he felt no regret for having shared his vulnerabilities with someone who had proven so worthy of his trust. Catherine, ever sensitive to the dynamics around her, began to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. The simple human moment of connection she had shared with Charles was now a public event that would be dissected and interpreted by media outlets around the world. Yet she felt proud of the comfort she had been able to provide to a man struggling with the enormous responsibilities of leadership. Princess Anne approached the group with her characteristic directness, her presence serving to break some of the tension that had built up around Charles and Catherine. Her practical nature helped restore a sense of normalcy to the situation, though she understood better than most that the evening would be remembered for this moment rather than any of the formal diplomatic business that had originally been planned. The string quartet, recognizing that some form of musical intervention might help restore the evening's flow, began playing again. Their choice of a gentle pichelbel canon provided a beautiful backdrop to the complex emotions swirling through the room, while signaling to the guests that the formal portion of the evening could perhaps resume. William stepped closer to his wife and father, his presence adding another layer of family solidarity to the moment. Rather than showing anger or jealousy, his expression reflected understanding and support for both Catherine and Charles. His maturity in handling this delicate situation would later be cited as evidence of his readiness to eventually assume the crown himself. Camilla joined the family group, her arrival completing the picture of royal unity that would help define how this moment was interpreted by observers. Rather than division or scandal, what the assembled dignitaries now saw was a family that had weathered an emotional moment together, emerging stronger for having shared authentic human connection. The conversations throughout the ballroom gradually resumed, though they had all been fundamentally altered by what everyone had witnessed. The formal diplomatic discussions about trade agreements and international cooperation now seemed somehow less significant than the human drama that had unfolded before their eyes. The Danish queen found herself reflecting on the challenges of balancing public duty with private emotions, a struggle she understood from her own royal experience. Charles, with his composure now restored but his gratitude for Catherine's understanding unchanged, addressed the family group that had gathered around them. His words were few but heartfelt, acknowledging the unusual circumstances while reaffirming the love and respect that bound them together as a family. His brief statement helped contextualize the moment for observers, making it clear that what they had witnessed was an expression of family bonds rather than anything inappropriate. The master of the household, recognizing an opportunity to restore some structure to the evening, quietly signaled that the dancing portion of the function could begin. The orchestra transitioned smoothly into music suitable for formal dancing, providing both distraction and entertainment for guests who were still processing what they had observed. As couples began to take the floor for the evening's first dance, Charles extended his hand to Camilla in a gesture that reaffirmed their partnership and marriage. Their dance together, watched carefully by everyone present, demonstrated the solid foundation of their relationship and helped dispel any concerns about the implications of the earlier moment with Catherine. William and Catherine also joined the dancing, their obvious comfort and affection with each other providing another layer of reassurance to observers who might have misinterpreted the significance of the earlier interaction. Their partnership on the dance floor reflected the strength of their marriage and their mutual support through the unique challenges of royal life. The evening continued with a grace and dignity that impressed all the international guests. Rather than becoming a scandal or source of embarrassment, the moment of authentic emotion between Charles and Catherine had somehow enhanced the evening's significance. The diplomatic observers found themselves impressed by the royal family's ability to handle an unexpected situation with such maturity and unity. As the evening drew to its close and guests began to depart, the conversations inevitably returned to what they had witnessed. However, the tone of these discussions was largely positive, focusing on the humanity and authenticity they had seen in the British royal family rather than any hint of impropriety or scandal. The media coverage that followed in the days and weeks after the event largely reflected the positive interpretation that had emerged among the diplomatic observers. Rather than sensationalizing the moment, most outlets chose to frame it as an example of the strong family bonds within the modern royal family and evidence of Catherine's positive influence on the monarchy. Catherine's handling of the situation was universally praised, with commentators noting her grace under pressure and her ability to provide genuine emotional support while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Her response to Charles's gesture of gratitude had demonstrated both her empathy and her understanding of royal protocol. Charles himself gained respect for his willingness to show vulnerability and his clear appreciation for the support of his family. Rather than seeing weakness in his emotional openness, the public and media interpreted it as evidence of his humanity and his commitment to modernizing the monarchy while maintaining its essential dignity. The evening that had begun as a routine state function had evolved into something much more significant. It became remembered as a moment when the royal family demonstrated that authentic human emotion and connection could coexist with the formal requirements of constitutional monarchy. The gesture that had initially seemed so shocking ultimately strengthened public perception of the royal family as genuine people dealing with genuine emotions while serving their country with dedication and grace. The bond between Charles and Catherine that had been revealed that evening continued to strengthen over the years that followed, providing both of them with the family support that made their individual royal duties more sustainable. Their relationship became an example of how the modern monarchy could maintain its traditions while embracing the authentic human connections that made it relevant to contemporary society. The silence that had fallen over the ballroom when Charles reached for Catherine became, in retrospect, a moment of recognition. The assembled dignitaries and observers had witnessed something rare and precious, the sight of genuine human emotion and family love operating within the formal structures of constitutional monarchy. Rather than diminishing the institution, it had revealed the humanity that gave the monarchy its enduring strength and relevance.